everyone, so today I'm going to share a few tips I have about growing orchids. So orchids are actually pretty easy to grow as houseplants, but there are some things to note to be successful. So these are just some tips I've picked up along the way. As I've had these for the past few years, I'm by no means an expert, but the first thing to know is that there are different species of orchids, and each species is going to have different lighting requirements and different moisture requirements. So this comes down to where they are placed in your home and how often they're watered, but also how they are potted. Here it's south facing and I have a really large window, so it gets a good amount of sunlight. But I have these orchids in the back of the room where many of my houseplants would not do well back here, but the orchids actually like this kind of moderate light level. Of course, this depends on the species. I have an Oncidium orchid right here, and it can actually take some brighter light. So definitely research the species of orchid you have and make sure it has the correct light level. The second thing is watering. Now I'm first going to talk about the potting medium, because this will affect your watering. So that each species of orchid has different moisture requirements. And so you want to make sure you have a proper soil blend for your species of orchid. And so when I got these orchids, they had long stems, and after a couple years, they have formed baby plants at the top of that stem where the flower was. And last fall, I cut those off because they had grown some longer roots, and I potted them up. So, and these Mama Phalaenopsis, the soil in them was the original grocery store potting soil, and I knew that that needed to be replaced and freshened up because it had been a few years. So what I did, I went online and I found an orchid supply. This video is not endorsed by them. I'm just sharing where I went if you're looking for some orchid supplies. But I went on there and I found a Phalaenopsis soil blend. So they make different blends for each species. And it has just a different combination of bark. I don't know what these are, but it's kind of like a pumice type material. And then I also bought a flake of sphagnum moss. It comes dehydrated, and I just broke some pieces off and rehydrated them. So for the Phalaenopsis, I used mostly the soil blend, but also took some of the sphagnum moss and mixed it in there, because the sphagnum moss holds a little bit more moisture than some of these other materials. So that is the potting medium that I used. You want to make sure that the orchids have good aeration, and it comes down to a correct blend of that potting mix. Another thing is the container choice. So you want containers that have these holes in them. So that's going to increase the aeration around the orchid. Before I go too far, I think a lot of people think tropics and moisture and wet when it comes to orchids, but orchids, you know, they live in trees, and they basically grow in kind of like soil that has accumulated in crevices and things like that. So they're not actually growing in soil, so they are used to having a lot of airflow around the roots and to drying out. And so we want to mimic that with our potting medium. So what I did, I just got these plastic pots that are made for orchids. And I also had these ceramic ones. And you could pot directly into the ceramic ones, but I chose to pot in the plastic one and just set it in the ceramic one for a more decorative look. Now the next tip is about watering frequency, and I'll just share how I do that. So I water these no more than once a week. Sometimes I go a couple weeks if I forget. So it's definitely key here not to overwater. You do not want moisture sitting around these roots at all. So what I do, I just collect all of the orchids, I set them in the kitchen sink, and I just use the shower head, and I just soak them for maybe about a minute. And I really make sure all of the soil medium gets moisture. I kind of help clean the dust off, and I use just very slightly warm water when I do this. And then I just let the orchids sit in the sink and let them dry off, and once the pots have dried off, I just bring them all back in here. So it really is that simple. It's not complicated at all to water them. It is better to actually go longer in between waterings than it would be to overwater. The last thing is to fertilize on a regular schedule. So I got a specific orchid fertilizer as the recommended blend. This is just a liquid, and so I actually use like half of this amount every time I water. And so you want to water, they say weekly, as in you can water or fertilize more often, but do it very weekly. I don't do this through the winter, but I do it more in the spring and the summertime. So those are just some things I have found that I've done in caring for these orchids. You all take care, and I hope you all will try growing some orchids.